What if the oldest stories we have are not beginnings at all but fragments of something already broken? What if the first written words humanity ever pressed into clay were not attempts to explain the world, but quiet efforts to remember what had already slipped away? In the low light of deep time, absence can feel heavier than presence, and silence can speak louder than myth. Tonight, allow your thoughts to move slowly, like dust settling over forgotten ruins. We are not searching for gods yet. We are listening for what comes before them. If this kind of quiet exploration resonates with you, take a moment, before you drift too far, to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And if you wish, share where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. For now, rest with the idea that history may not begin with creation, but with loss, like footprints leading into darkness, asking whether we are brave enough to follow. The first clay tablets of Sumer do not arrive like hesitant beginnings. They emerge already confident, already precise, already burdened with the weight of systems that appear fully formed. When archaeologists first lifted them from the soil of southern Mesopotamia, they expected something primitive, something transitional, something that would show humanity learning how to speak to itself in symbols. Instead, they found administration, accounting, astronomy, agriculture, law. They found lists, measurements, calendars, boundaries. They found a civilization speaking as if it had been doing so for a very long time. These tablets do not pause to explain why writing exists. They do not celebrate its invention. There is no reverence for novelty. Writing is treated as infrastructure, not miracle. The marks pressed into clay feel less like a discovery, and more like maintenance, as though someone had returned to a tool already familiar, already trusted, already essential. This alone unsettles the standard narrative of gradual progress. Civilizations usually announce their awakenings loudly. Sumer whispers, and that whisper suggests continuity rather than birth. Inside the tablets, there is a deeper stillness. The earliest texts rarely speak of gods at all. They record grain yields, land transfers, labor obligations, celestial cycles. They assume order. They assume prior agreement. They assume a world already shaped, divided, named. Rivers have identities, cities have borders, fields have owners. Time itself is segmented into units that imply long observation rather than sudden insight. Nothing about these records feels experimental. Everything feels inherited. This is where the silence begins to matter. In later mythological texts, the gods arrive dramatically, shaping humanity from clay, descending from the heavens, imposing order on chaos. But in the earliest administrative tablets, chaos is nowhere to be found. Order already exists. Systems already function. The gods, when they eventually appear in later layers of writing, feel less like creators and more like explanations added after the fact. The tablets do not say this explicitly. They do not need to. Their calm efficiency speaks for them. Scholars often describe early Sumerian civilization as a sudden fluorescence, an inexplicable leap forward. Agriculture refined, irrigation mastered, urban planning established, writing standardized. The phrase appears again and again in academic literature, as if repetition could soften its implications, sudden, abrupt, without clear antecedents. These words are meant to describe a mystery, but they also conceal one. They frame the problem as an anomaly rather than a signal. The tablets themselves suggest something else. They carry traces of compression, long traditions condensed into practical form, knowledge streamlined for survival rather than exploration. The writing is utilitarian, stripped of origin stories. That absence does not feel accidental. It feels deliberate, or at least inevitable, the way a survivor remembers what is necessary and forgets what is dangerous to recall. When memory becomes heavy, it learns to travel light. Cuneiform signs show layers of evolution, but not the kind expected from spontaneous invention. Some symbols appear abstracted from earlier pictographs that are already missing from the record. The transition from image to abstraction feels too smooth, too efficient, as if the learning curve happened somewhere else, sometime earlier, under conditions no longer visible. The tablets we have feel like second drafts of history, not first attempts. Even the language encoded in them carries a strange detachment. Sumerian grammar reflects a worldview deeply concerned with process, function, and status rather than narrative drama. Actions matter more than actors. Outcomes matter more than origins. This linguistic structure aligns with a culture focused on continuity, not myth-making. It is the language of caretakers, not pioneers, of record-keepers, not dreamers. Later generations would surround these same systems with divine justification. Kings would rule by mandate from the heavens. Temples would claim cosmic authority. Myths would bloom like ivy over stone foundations. But the foundations themselves remained stubbornly secular in their earliest form. They speak of humans managing a world that already works, rather than inventing one from scratch. The gods feel absent, not because they were forgotten, but because they had not yet been summoned to explain anything. This absence has disturbed scholars for over a century, though it is often discussed in footnotes rather than conclusions. The discomfort lies not in what the tablets say, but in what they do not say. There is no account of discovery, no celebration of first principles, no myth of emergence tied to the invention of civilization itself. Instead, there is routine, there is obligation, there is continuity. Such patterns raise an uncomfortable possibility. Civilizations may not always remember their own beginnings. They may inherit ruins as instructions rather than warnings. They may rebuild on foundations whose original architects are no longer remembered, or no longer named. In that scenario, writing becomes less an act of creation, and more an act of preservation, an attempt to stabilize something already slipping. The earliest Sumerian tablets feel like messages written during a pause, a moment of relative calm after something vast and destabilizing. They do not record catastrophe, but they behave like survivors of one. Their focus is narrow, practical, grounded. They conserve energy. They do not speculate. They do not look back too far. They do not look forward too boldly. They maintain. Later myths would fill the silence with gods, floods, divine wrath, and cosmic drama. But the tablets themselves remain indifferent to spectacle. They stand quietly at the edge of history, holding a shape that does not quite fit the story told about them. They suggest that before the gods arrived in narrative form, something else already governed the world, something structured, something human, something older than myth, yet close enough to leave its fingerprints in clay. And beneath that quiet order, beneath those careful lines pressed into wet earth, there lingers the sense that what we call the beginning may actually be a midpoint, marked not by emergence, but by recovery. The continuity problem does not announce itself loudly. It emerges slowly, like a fault line revealed only after the ground has settled. When scholars attempt to trace the development of Sumerian civilization backward, step by step, layer by layer, they encounter not a gentle slope but a sudden edge. The trail thins, then vanishes. Writing does not gradually coalesce from scratches and symbols. Urban planning does not stumble forward through crude attempts. Irrigation does not appear as a sequence of failures refined over centuries. Instead, these systems stand upright at the earliest moment they are visible, balanced and interlocked, as though assembled elsewhere before being set down intact. In most human histories, complexity leaves behind a mess. Experiments, errors, abandoned methods, transitional artifacts. Stone tools show false starts. Pottery styles mutate awkwardly before stabilizing. Language fragments reveal hesitation and drift. In southern Mesopotamia, this debris is strangely absent. The archaeological record before the Ubaid and Uruk periods grows thin in precisely the places where it should be thickest. This absence is often attributed to preservation bias or incomplete excavation, explanations that function as technical placeholders rather than satisfying answers. The ground is silent where it should be crowded. What emerges instead is a civilization that behaves as if it remembers rules it did not invent. City layouts align with water management strategies that presume long familiarity with river behavior. Crop cycles reflect intimate knowledge of seasonal variability. Mathematical systems employ base 60 with a fluency that implies extended use rather than sudden inspiration. None of these elements appear to be in rehearsal. They perform without warming up. The idea of gradual development struggles here, not because gradualism is flawed, but because the evidence refuses to cooperate. To maintain the standard timeline, one must assume centuries of invisible progress, entire generations refining techniques without leaving behind a trace. This assumption grows heavier with each additional system that appears fully operational. Writing alone might be explained away. Writing plus advanced mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and bureaucracy becomes more difficult. Together, they begin to resemble inheritance rather than invention. Sumerian king lists deepen this unease. They do not begin with humble village leaders or tribal elders. They open with rulers whose reigns stretch across impossibly long spans of time, placed deliberately before a great flood. These names are often dismissed as symbolic or mythological, yet their structure mirrors later historical records. The list does not change its tone when transitioning from legendary to accepted history. It does not signal a shift from myth to fact. It simply shortens the reigns. Memory compresses, but it does not reset. This continuity suggests that the compilers of these lists perceived themselves as heirs, not originators. They were organizing something older than themselves, something already layered. Their task was not to invent a past, but to arrange it into a form that could be carried forward. In doing so, they may have simplified, abstracted, and filtered. Complexity gives way to stability. Extremes are rounded into narrative shapes. The result is not a lie, but a reduction. Geology offers a parallel unease. Sediment cores from the region reveal cycles of flooding far older than the Sumerians themselves. Rivers wandered, climates shifted, coastlines moved. Human presence flickers in and out of visibility. Some settlements disappear entirely beneath layers of silt. Others leave only scattered remains. The landscape itself behaves like an editor, erasing chapters while preserving fragments. What survives is not necessarily what was most important, but what was most adaptable. Against this backdrop, Sumerian civilization appears less like a dawn and more like a reassembly. People returning to fertile ground after disruption, reconstructing systems that once existed in fuller form. The suddenness may not represent innovation, but recollection under pressure. Knowledge passed down orally, ritually, practically, until conditions allowed it to be fixed again in clay. When writing appears, it does not narrate the past. It stabilizes the present. This perspective reframes the mystery. Instead of asking how Sumer rose so quickly, the more unsettling realization is that something capable of teaching such complexity may have existed earlier, without leaving behind a proportional material footprint. That does not require lost supercivilizations or speculative technologies. It only requires time, erosion, and selective memory. Civilizations do not need to vanish completely to be forgotten. They only need to lose their storytellers. Institutions once formed tend to protect coherence over truth. A smooth origin story is easier to maintain than a fractured one. Over time, histories that imply regression or collapse become uncomfortable. They undermine confidence. They suggest vulnerability. It is safer to imagine humanity climbing steadily upward than stumbling, falling, and climbing again. The record we inherit often reflects this preference. Yet the tablets remain indifferent to our comfort. They do not explain themselves. They do not justify their existence. They simply continue. Their presence implies a past that was sufficient enough to generate them, and a break significant enough to make them feel like beginnings. The contradiction lives quietly between those two facts. As layers of civilization accumulate, earlier layers grow harder to access. Each generation builds upon the last, obscuring foundations while depending on them. The Sumerians, standing at one such crossroads, left behind records that reveal more through omission than declaration. Their world does not feel young, it feels resumed. What came before does not announce itself with monuments or epics. It lingers in the efficiency of systems that do not explain their own origins. It survives in numbers that encode time beyond immediate necessity. It echoes in lists that stretch backward into abstraction without apology. Continuity, once broken, leaves scars that can be mistaken for beginnings. And when history begins at the scar rather than the wound, the narrative feels complete, even as something essential remains missing, waiting beneath the surface of clay and silt, unresolved. The antediluvian kings do not behave like legends trying to impress. They appear instead as entries in a ledger, arranged with care, stacked one after another, each reign measured and recorded with unsettling precision. When the Sumerian king lists names rulers who governed for tens of thousands of years, it does so without embellishment. There is no explanation, no metaphor, no apology. These spans of time are not framed as miracles or divine punishments. They are simply stated as if duration itself were once understood differently. Modern readers are quick to dismiss these numbers as symbolic, and there is comfort in that dismissal. Symbolism is safe. It allows exaggeration to stand in for misunderstanding. Yet the structure of the list resists this convenience. The same document that records these vast reigns also preserves historically verifiable dynasties with accurate sequencing. It does not separate myth from history with a change in format or tone. It reduces the reign lengths gradually, smoothly, as though memory were compressing something too large to carry intact. The kings before the flood are not described as gods. They are called kings. Their authority is political, not divine. The gods appear later, intervening, judging, granting legitimacy. Before that intervention, rulership exists without celestial justification. This detail is often overlooked, yet it reshapes the entire narrative. Power precedes theology. Governance precedes worship. The structure of society exists before the stories meant to explain it. Numbers in Sumerian culture were not arbitrary. The sexagesimal system was used for accounting, astronomy, and geometry. It was precise, functional, and deeply embedded in daily life. When the king list assigns reigns of 28,800 years or 36,000 years, it does so using units consistent with this system. These values are not random. They are multiples. They fit patterns. They suggest a method of reckoning that once aligned with lived experience, even if that experience is no longer accessible. One interpretation sees these immense lifespans as reflections of dynastic duration, rather than individual longevity. A ruling house remembered as a single continuous authority, later compressed into the name of one king. This explanation does not negate the mystery, it intensifies it. A dynasty lasting tens of thousands of years implies stability across geological and climatic shifts that challenge conventional timelines. It suggests social continuity under conditions we assume would prevent it. Another perspective treats the numbers as markers of time cycles rather than literal years. Long ages remembered through astronomical or ritual frameworks, translated imperfectly into later historical accounting. In this view, the kings become anchors for epochs, rather than individuals. Memory attaches to names because names are easier to preserve than processes. Even so, the implication remains the same. The past was deeper, longer, and more structured than our simplified narratives allow. The flood that divides the list is not described in detail. It functions as a boundary, a reset point. Before it, reigns stretch beyond human comprehension. After it, they contract sharply into spans that resemble ordinary history. This shift mirrors changes seen in other traditions, where time itself appears to accelerate after catastrophe. Longevity shortens, memory narrows, life becomes more immediate, the world grows heavier. What matters is not whether the antediluvian kings lived for thousands of years in a biological sense. What matters is that the Sumerians believed, or remembered, that authority once persisted across spans of time no longer imaginable. They recorded this belief with the same seriousness they applied to harvest records and temple inventories. The distinction between myth and administration dissolves in this context. Memory is treated as data. These long reigns may encode a perception of lost stability, a world before disruption, where cycles were slower, where change arrived gradually, where leadership endured long enough to shape landscapes rather than merely manage them. After the flood, the list reads like a world in recovery. Dynasties rise and fall quickly. Cities compete. Power fragments. History accelerates. The king list does not mourn this change. It does not explain it. It simply records. Its neutrality is its most unsettling feature. There is no sense of awe directed at the past, only acknowledgement. The past is larger, but it is not sacred. It is simply earlier. This framing challenges modern assumptions about myth-making. Myths are often thought to grow over time, accumulating exaggeration. The Sumerian record suggests the opposite. Early memory is expansive. Later memory contracts. The gods, when they appear more prominently, do not expand history. They compress it. They offer reasons where records once offered continuity. The antediluvian kings stand at the threshold of this compression. They are neither fully mythic nor comfortably historical. They occupy a liminal space where memory has not yet decided what to discard. Their vast reigns resist easy interpretation because they are not designed to persuade. They are designed to preserve. As centuries passed, these numbers became increasingly implausible to later cultures, including the Sumerians themselves. But rather than remove them, the scribes kept them. They copied them again and again, even as their own lifespans shortened and their own histories grew more turbulent. This act of preservation suggests reverence not for accuracy, but for continuity. To erase the numbers would be to admit a break too severe to reconcile. The antediluvian kings remain as silhouettes against a deep past, not illuminated, not explained, but carefully outlined. They imply a time when human structures endured longer than human memory now allows. A time remembered not through story, but through scale. When later traditions filled the pre-flood world with gods and monsters, they added colour to what had already faded. But beneath those additions, the Sumerian list preserves a quieter truth. History did not begin small and grow large. It began vast and has been narrowing ever since, carrying forward only what can still be held. Beneath the cities of southern Mesopotamia lies a record that does not speak in words. It settles instead in layers, silt pressed upon silt, river clay hardened by time, bands of sediment marking moments when the land itself changed faster than memory could adapt. Long before the Sumerians shaped canals and temples, the rivers were already restless. The Tigris and Euphrates shifted course repeatedly, flooding plains, retreating, and returning again with quiet persistence. These movements wrote their own history, one that human hands could not edit. Excavations at sites like Ur, Kij, and Shurupak revealed thick flood deposits separating occupation layers. In some cases, entire settlements appear abruptly sealed beneath uniform bands of clay, as though life paused and resumed elsewhere. Early archaeologists debated whether these layers represented a single catastrophic flood or a series of regional inundations. What matters more than the number is the pattern. Human presence does not disappear forever. It re-emerges, reorganized, altered, carrying less with it than before. Geological time does not respect human chronology. Floods erase gradually as well as suddenly. A settlement abandoned for a few generations may leave behind only traces too faint to recognize as continuity. Wood rots, textiles dissolve, unfired clay returns to earth. What survives is what resists water and pressure. Stone and baked brick endure. Writing, ironically, survives best when disaster strikes before it can be erased by daily use. Catastrophe preserves selectively. When Sumerian myths later speak of a great flood, they echo this geological reality, but they do not create it. The flood is not an invention. It is a memory shaped into narrative. The earliest flood layers predate written myth, suggesting that experience came first, explanation later. The land remembers long before language does. Climate data from ice cores and sediment records indicate periods of rapid environmental change around the end of the last ice age. Rising sea levels flooded coastlines. Meltwater pulses altered river systems. Fertile zones shifted, sometimes violently. Communities adapted, migrated, or collapsed. Over generations, these adjustments would feel like resets rather than transitions. Knowledge would fracture, pass down unevenly, losing coherence as conditions changed. In such a world, continuity becomes fragile. Techniques survive where they are useful, vanish where they are not. A method of irrigation perfected under one river regime may fail under another. Agricultural calendars tied to predictable seasons falter when climate destabilizes. What endures is not the full system, but fragments that can be repurposed. Memory becomes modular. The Sumerian resurgence appears in the wake of this instability. When urban life reasserts itself, it does so in places where geography allows control to be re-established. Floodplains are tamed through canals. Cities rise on mounds built from earlier ruins. Each layer compresses the past beneath the present, physically and conceptually. The city becomes a palimpsest, written over again and again. Archaeology often treats gaps in occupation as absences of people. More often, they are absences of detectability. Nomadic or semi-sedentary communities leave lighter traces. Oral traditions do not fossilize easily. Knowledge can persist without architecture, without permanent markers. A society may continue without being visible to those who arrive millennia later, with trowels and grids. This complicates the idea of sudden emergence. What appears abrupt in the material record may reflect a shift in expression rather than existence. When conditions stabilize, knowledge that survived in dispersed form can crystallize rapidly. Writing, administration, and monumental architecture reappear not because they were invented anew, but because they once again became viable. The flood layers in Mesopotamia function as more than geological events. They are memory barriers. On one side lies a past remembered as expansive, continuous, perhaps even timeless. On the other lies a narrower world, where history must be recorded quickly before it is lost again. The urgency of early writing may stem from this awareness. Clay tablets become anchors against forgetting. This perspective reframes the Sumerian flood myths not as exaggerations but as compressions. Multiple events, spanning centuries folded into a single story. Memory condenses when it must travel far. The narrative flood stands in for a longer era of instability that reshaped human life repeatedly, leaving scars rather than a single wound. Geological evidence does not support a single global flood, but it does support repeated devastating regional ones. For the people living through them, the distinction would matter little. Survival does not catalogue scale, it catalogues impact. A flood that erases one's world is total, regardless of its geographic reach. As cities were rebuilt, the relationship between humans and their environment shifted. Control replaced adaptation. Canals imposed order on rivers that had once dictated terms. This inversion marks a psychological turning point. Civilization becomes an act of defiance against instability, a refusal to remain at the mercy of cycles remembered too well. The tablets that emerge in this context do not dwell on disaster. They focus on regulation, measurement, predictability. They count grain, assign labor, track celestial movements. These are tools of stabilization. They suggest a culture determined to prevent forgetting, to bind time into manageable units. What lies beneath the flood layers remains fragmentary, not because it lacked complexity, but because complexity does not always fossilize. The Earth keeps its own archive, one that favors resilience over richness. What survives into history is what can endure pressure, repetition, and erasure. The geological record and the written record converge in their silences. Both hint at a world repeatedly interrupted, never entirely extinguished, always reshaped. Civilization, in this light, is not a straight ascent but a series of recoveries, each one carrying less of the original weight. The Sumerians stood on ground already heavy with loss. Their achievements rise not from emptiness, but from layers of forgotten attempts. Beneath their cities, the earth holds stories that writing arrived too late to fully capture, leaving behind only the suggestion of a deeper past, pressed quietly into clay and stone. Before the gods step onto the stage of Sumerian myth, the world they inherit is already measured. This detail hides in plain sight, embedded in the phrasing of early texts, easy to overlook because it does not announce itself. Land is divided, boundaries are fixed. Canals follow planned routes. Cities possess names that imply history rather than novelty. None of this is presented as miraculous. It is treated as given, as if the act of ordering the world preceded the stories meant to justify that order. In the earliest layers of Sumerian writing, the landscape feels domesticated in a way that suggests long familiarity. Fields are described by size and yield, not by discovery. Rivers are managed through networks that presume accumulated knowledge of flooding patterns and seasonal rhythms. Even disputes over land assume a shared understanding of precedent. Arguments are not about what ownership is, but about who holds it. The framework already exists. When gods eventually appear in later texts, they do not arrive to create the land, they arrive to claim it. Temples rise not as the first structures, but as centers that absorb and reorganize what already functions. Divine authority overlays human systems rather than generating them. The gods legitimize boundaries that were drawn before their names were spoken in clay. This sequence matters. In many mythologies, the gods form the earth, separate sky from ground, and bring order to chaos. In the Sumerian record, chaos is curiously absent from the earliest practical texts. Order exists quietly, without cosmological drama. The myths come later, filling a narrative gap rather than describing an experienced reality. They explain why the world is ordered, not how it became so. The language itself reinforces this impression. Early Sumerian texts rarely dwell on origins. They focus on function. A canal is something to be maintained. A field is something to be measured. A city is something to be administered. This pragmatic tone suggests a culture oriented toward continuity rather than beginnings. The past is not interrogated, it is assumed. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of rapid innovation under favourable conditions. Fertile soil, abundant water, and population density combine to accelerate development. Yet this explanation strains under scrutiny. Innovation leaves traces of trial and error. Here, trial is missing. Error is invisible. The systems appear calibrated from the start. The naming of cities offers another subtle clue. Many city names do not translate cleanly into descriptive terms. They feel inherited, opaque, possibly older than the language that records them. Names often survive longer than meanings. A city name can outlive the culture that first spoke it. In this sense, names act as fossils, preserving echoes of earlier tongues and earlier worlds. Temples, too, suggest inheritance. Early temple complexes are often built atop earlier structures, sometimes without clear understanding of what lay beneath. Each layer sanctifies the previous one by covering it. Over time, the sacred accumulates vertically, burying its own origins. The gods appear to dwell at the top of a stack whose base has been forgotten. In administrative texts, references to land allotments sometimes imply previous distributions. Phrases suggest reassignment rather than initial division. This subtlety points to a society managing continuity rather than creating ex nihilo. Land passes hands, authority shifts, but the underlying framework persists. When mythological texts later describe gods assigning roles, creating humans to work the land and establishing kingship, they mirror processes that were already in motion. The myths do not invent these structures, they narrativize them. They give cosmic weight to social realities that may have long predated the stories themselves. This inversion challenges the assumption that religion always precedes civilization. In Sumer, it may have followed it. The sacred becomes a way to stabilize what already exists, to anchor human systems in something eternal. After periods of disruption, such anchoring becomes attractive. It promises permanence in a world that has proven unstable. The gods in this light function as custodians of memory. They hold the authority that humans can no longer trace directly. By attributing origins to divine acts, societies protect themselves from the discomfort of forgotten human beginnings. Mystery replaces loss. Reverence replaces uncertainty. Yet the earliest texts resist this move. They remain stubbornly grounded. They do not mythologize their own foundations. They simply operate within them. This suggests that the transition from a pre-divine to a divine narrative world was gradual, driven by social needs rather than sudden revelation. As generations passed, the gap between lived memory and inherited structure widened. What had once been remembered directly became abstract. At that point, myth becomes necessary. It bridges the distance between present and past, offering meaning where detail has eroded. The gods step in where human memory steps back. The world before the gods, as hinted at in these tablets, is not empty or primitive. It is organized, functional, and quietly complex. It lacks the drama of creation because it does not need it. Its drama may lie instead in what it survived, in what it managed to preserve without explanation. By the time divine narratives dominate the written record, the earlier silence has already done its work. The foundations are set. The stories can rise without threatening stability. The gods inherit a world that humans shaped, forgot, and then explained away. This sequence leaves behind an unease that lingers beneath the myths. If the gods arrived after order, then order itself has a deeper origin. It suggests a human capacity for structure that does not require divine intervention, only time, memory, and resilience. And it suggests that what we call beginnings may often be moments when explanation becomes necessary, not when creation occurs. The tablets do not argue this point. They do not need to. Their calm descriptions of a measured world speak quietly of a time when structure preceded story, and when the most important acts left no myth behind, only systems that continued to function long after their makers were no longer named. Language carries memory in ways stone and clay cannot. It preserves not only what is said, but how thought itself is shaped. In the case of Sumerian, this becomes especially revealing. The structure of the language does not behave like one newly formed. It shows no signs of searching for balance or efficiency. Instead, it appears settled, confident in its internal logic, as though shaped over long stretches of time no longer visible in the historical record. Sumerian is a language isolate. It does not clearly descend from any known linguistic family, nor does it leave behind obvious descendants. This isolation has often been treated as a curiosity, a dead end. Yet isolation can also be a sign of deep age. Languages that have existed long enough often diverge beyond recognition, shedding relatives through extinction and assimilation. What remains appears solitary, but only because everything around it has changed. The grammar of Sumerian reflects a worldview oriented toward process and state rather than narrative flow. Verbs encode not only action but completion, intention, and relational context. Agency is distributed carefully, sometimes de-emphasizing the actor in favor of the act itself. This is not the grammar of a culture discovering expression. It is the grammar of one refining it. Such linguistic sophistication does not emerge overnight. Grammar evolves through use, through countless adjustments driven by social needs. Irregularities fossilize, shortcuts become standard, patterns stabilize. The result is a language optimized for the realities it serves. Sumerian feels optimized, not experimental. Early texts demonstrate remarkable consistency in usage. Administrative records from different cities adhere to shared conventions, suggesting a standardized linguistic framework already in place. Standardization implies prior variation that has been resolved. That resolution leaves little trace, only the final form. The process disappears, leaving behind the illusion of sudden arrival. Language also encodes cultural priorities. In Sumerian, there is an abundance of terms related to labor, land, measurement, and social roles. These concepts are linguistically granular, suggesting they mattered deeply and had long histories. By contrast, abstract philosophical speculation is relatively muted in early texts. This imbalance points to a culture shaped by practical continuity rather than sudden ideological shifts. Even the way Sumerian handles time is revealing. Temporal markers often emphasize cycles and states rather than linear progression. Time is something managed, allocated, and completed. This aligns with agricultural rhythms and administrative needs, but it also suggests a long familiarity with repetition. Cultures new to settled life often emphasize change and novelty. Here, the emphasis rests on return. Writing systems mirror this maturity. Cuneiform evolves from pictographic beginnings, but the earliest surviving examples already show abstraction and efficiency. Signs are repurposed, simplified, and standardized. The learning curve that must have preceded this stage is missing. Like the grammar, it feels like the end of a process, not the beginning. The absence of earlier linguistic stages in the record does not imply they never existed. It implies they did not survive in durable form. Oral language leaves few fossils. Entire linguistic worlds can vanish without trace, especially if disrupted by migration, climate change, or social collapse. What survives is often the language of recovery, not the language of origin. Sumerian's isolation may reflect such a recovery phase, a language preserved because it was tied to administration, ritual, and identity, while others around it faded or transformed. In this view, Sumerian becomes a linguistic survivor, carrying within it structures shaped by experiences older than its written record. As later Semitic languages like Akkadian rise to prominence, Sumerian does not disappear immediately. It becomes a scholarly and liturgical language, preserved deliberately by scribes. This preservation mirrors the treatment of the antediluvian kings and flood myths. Older forms are kept, even when they no longer align with daily life. Reverence replaces utility. This deliberate preservation suggests an awareness of depth. The scribes knew Sumerian was old. They treated it as a vessel of authority and tradition. By copying and teaching it long after it ceased to be spoken widely, they extended its life artificially, freezing it in a form that could still transmit something essential. Language in this sense becomes a time capsule, not because it tells stories of the distant past, but because it embodies ways of thinking shaped by that past. The choices embedded in grammar, the categories deemed important, the relationships encoded between subject and object. All of these reflect a world that existed before the gods dominated narrative space. The gods, when they later fill Sumerian literature, speak through this language. They inherit its structure. They operate within its constraints. Divine speech is shaped by human grammar forged in an earlier context. This inversion is subtle but profound. Language does not bend to theology. Theology bends to language. This suggests that the cognitive framework of Sumerian culture was established before the rise of overt religious narrative. The gods are layered onto an existing mental architecture. They explain and legitimize, but they do not redefine the underlying categories of thought. In this way, Sumerian functions as a linguistic fossil bed. It preserves traces of a worldview that predates its own myths. The deeper one looks, the more apparent it becomes that language itself carries evidence of continuity beneath apparent beginnings. What remains is not a clear picture of that earlier world, but an outline shaped by absence. The grammar holds space for processes remembered rather than explained. The vocabulary reflects systems already normalized. The isolation of the language hints at a long journey through disruption and survival. The tablets speak quietly, but the language they carry speaks across millennia. It does not announce its age. It does not demand interpretation. It simply persists, bearing the weight of forgotten centuries, reminding us that some of the oldest histories are not written in stories, but in the structures that make stories possible at all. Among the most quietly unsettling elements of early Sumerian civilization is its relationship with the sky. The tablets that survive do not present astronomy as a revelation or a divine gift. They treat the heavens as something already familiar, already mapped in functional ways. Stars are catalogued. Movements are tracked. Cycles are noted with a confidence that implies long observation rather than sudden curiosity. Early astronomical texts do not begin with origin stories. They do not explain how humans first noticed the stars or why celestial bodies matter. Instead, they operate within an established framework. Constellations are referenced as if their names and positions are common knowledge. Planetary movements are tracked using numerical systems that assume predictive reliability. This suggests a tradition of skywatching that extends far beyond the earlier surviving records. Astronomy requires patience. Patterns in planetary motion only reveal themselves over long spans of time. Retrograde movement, eclipse cycles, and lunar phases demand careful recording across generations. The sophistication present in Sumerian astronomical thought implies inheritance. Someone before them had already been watching long enough to teach others what to expect. The integration of astronomy into daily life further underscores this depth. Celestial cycles regulate agricultural calendars, religious festivals, and administrative schedules. Timekeeping systems align with lunar and solar rhythms in ways that suggest calibration rather than experimentation. Adjustments appear deliberate, refined through practice rather than guesswork. The sexagesimal number system again plays a central role. Its suitability for dividing circles and tracking celestial angles is striking. This mathematical choice is not arbitrary. It fits the needs of astronomy so well that it continues to shape how time and space are measured today. Such alignment between abstract number systems and physical observation rarely happens by accident. It reflects long-term refinement guided by specific needs. In later mythological texts, gods are associated with planets and stars, but this association feels symbolic rather than foundational. The sky was mapped before it was mythologized. Deities become names attached to celestial bodies that were already tracked and understood. The mythology follows the measurement, not the other way around. The Molap in tablets, compiled later but drawing on older traditions, preserve star lists and observational data that hint at centuries of accumulated knowledge. These texts organize the sky into structured sections, linking heliacal risings to seasonal changes. Such organization requires continuity. It presumes that earlier observations were reliable enough to build upon. What is absent is just as telling. There is little speculation about the nature of the cosmos in these early records. The focus remains practical. The sky is not a mystery to be pondered, but a system to be used. This utilitarian approach suggests familiarity rather than wonder. All may have existed, but it was not the primary driver of observation. The precision of eclipse prediction in later Mesopotamian astronomy builds on this foundation. While early Sumerians may not have fully predicted eclipses, the groundwork for such prediction is evident. Tracking lunar cycles with sufficient accuracy to later anticipate eclipses requires generations of disciplined record-keeping. The origin of that discipline is not documented, it is assumed. This assumption mirrors patterns seen elsewhere in the Sumerian record. Complex systems appear without clear origin stories because the culture that recorded them was not the culture that invented them. The inventors are absent not because they never existed, but because their work had already been absorbed into tradition by the time writing fixed it. Astronomy, perhaps more than any other discipline, resists rapid invention. The sky does not yield its patterns to brief attention. Knowledge accumulates slowly, often invisibly, until it reaches a threshold where it becomes actionable. The Sumerian record appears at that threshold, not at the beginning. Later civilizations would inherit and expand this knowledge. Babylonian astronomers refined predictive models. Greek thinkers reinterpreted them philosophically. Yet the foundational observations trace back to a time when the sky was already being watched carefully, long before gods were assigned to guide its motion. The absence of origin narratives in Sumerian astronomy suggests a cultural memory of loss. When knowledge survives disruption, its beginnings often do not. What remains is the usable core, stripped of its developmental history. This makes the knowledge feel sudden to later observers, even though it is anything but. Celestial observation also ties into the broader theme of continuity versus rupture. The sky remains constant even when societies change. Stars rise and set regardless of floods, migrations or collapses. In times of instability, the heavens become a reliable reference point. Watching the sky becomes an act of anchoring, a way to find order when the Earth refuses to provide it. This may explain the deep integration of astronomy into Sumerian culture. It is not merely scientific curiosity, it is a survival strategy. By aligning human activity with celestial cycles, societies impose predictability on an unpredictable world. The sky becomes a stabilizing partner in civilization. The gods, when they later dominate narratives, take on celestial roles because the sky already holds authority. Divine figures are mapped onto what is already powerful and reliable. This reinforces the idea that theology adapts to existing knowledge structures rather than creating them. In this light, Sumerian astronomy stands as another quiet testament to inheritance. It speaks of watchers whose names are lost, whose observations were passed down until they became background assumptions. The tablets preserve the results of their patience, not the story of their labor. The stars above Sumer were not discovered. They were remembered. Their patterns were trusted because they had already proven themselves over spans of time no longer accessible to the record. Beneath the myths and measurements, there lingers the sense of a deeper continuity, one written not in clay, but in repeated observation, carried forward until someone finally pressed it into tablets and called it knowledge. When the Sumerian record is placed alongside other ancient civilizations, a pattern begins to surface that feels less like coincidence and more like resonance. Egypt, the Indus Valley, and even early Mesoamerican societies emerge with their own abrupt sophistication, each rooted in different geographies, separated by vast distances, and yet sharing a strangely similar rhythm. Writing appears, urban planning stabilizes, astronomy aligns with ritual. Monumental architecture rises. The question is not one of contact, but of timing. Egyptian civilization, like Sumer, seems to step onto the stage already organized. The earliest dynasties show advanced stoneworking, complex religious systems, and administrative coherence. Hieroglyphs arrive fully expressive, capable of recording theology, economy, and history without a visible period of experimentation. The Nile, like the Tigris and Euphrates, provided predictable cycles, yet predictability alone does not account for the sudden crystallization of so many systems at once. The Indus Valley tells a similar story. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro reveal standardized brick sizes, sophisticated drainage, and urban layouts that suggest centralized planning. Their script remains undeciphered, but its consistency across vast regions implies an established communicative system. Here too there is little evidence of gradual assembly. The civilization appears coherent from its earliest visible phase. In Mesoamerica, cultures separated by oceans and millennia develop calendrical systems, astronomical alignments, and monumental architecture with striking parallels. While the specifics differ, the structural similarities are difficult to ignore. Time is tracked meticulously. Ritual and astronomy intertwine. Authority aligns itself with cosmic order. These features emerge independently, yet follow comparable patterns. The prevailing explanation frames these developments as parallel inventions driven by similar environmental pressures. River valleys encourage agriculture. Surplus enables specialization. Specialization fosters complexity. This model explains some aspects, but it does not fully address the synchrony. Why do these civilizations appear fully articulated rather than incrementally formed in the archaeological record? Why do their foundational systems seem to arrive together? One possibility is that humanity as a whole was responding to a shared backdrop of instability. Climatic shifts at the end of the last ice age affected regions globally, though unevenly. Rising seas, changing rainfall patterns, and shifting ecosystems forced human societies to adapt rapidly. In such conditions, knowledge that had accumulated over long periods may have been deployed suddenly when stability returned. This would create the illusion of abrupt emergence. Systems refined slowly under less visible conditions, nomadic, semi-sedentary, or dispersed, could crystallize once circumstances allowed. Writing, administration, and monumental architecture would then appear almost simultaneously, not because they were invented at that moment, but because they became necessary and sustainable. Comparative mythology offers subtle support for this view. Flood narratives appear across cultures, each tailored to local geography, but sharing core themes of loss, survival, and renewal. These stories do not need to describe the same event to reflect a shared experience of disruption. Memory adapts to context, but trauma leaves recognizable shapes. The similarities between early civilizations may therefore reflect not contact, but convergence. Different societies drawing from comparable reservoirs of inherited knowledge, shaped by parallel experiences of environmental stress and recovery. The gods, calendars, and monuments become culturally specific expressions of a broader human response to rebuilding. What complicates this picture is the precision found in these early systems. Calendars align with celestial cycles too accurately to be the product of hurried innovation. Urban layouts reflect foresight rather than improvisation. Writing systems encode complex languages efficiently from the outset. These features suggest preparation. The absence of transitional forms across multiple regions strengthens the case for a deeper, less visible phase of development. That phase may not have produced durable artifacts. Its knowledge may have been carried in practices, rituals, and oral transmission, vulnerable to loss yet capable of persistence. When stability returned in different parts of the world, this latent knowledge found expression. Each culture adapted it to local needs, producing diversity atop shared foundations. The result is a mosaic of civilizations that feel distinct yet strangely familiar. This perspective challenges linear models of progress. It suggests that human history moves in pulses rather than steps. Periods of accumulation alternate with periods of expression. What we see in the archaeological record are the expressions, not the accumulations. Sumer stands as one of the earliest visible expressions, but not necessarily the first accumulation. Its tablets, cities, and systems may represent a moment when memory, environment, and necessity aligned. Similar alignments occurred elsewhere, producing parallel awakenings rather than isolated miracles. The gods that populate these cultures often play similar roles: bringers of order, regulators of time, arbiters of justice. These roles reflect human priorities during reconstruction. They sanctify systems that must endure. They offer continuity when human memory feels fragile. By viewing early civilizations in comparative context, the mystery shifts. Instead of isolated anomalies, they become synchronized responses to shared conditions. The silence before them grows louder, suggesting a long prelude played across continents, mostly erased by time. What remains are echoes, cities rising from floodplains, calendars tracking stars, myths remembering loss. Together they hint at a chapter of human history that unfolded quietly, without monuments, before resurfacing in multiple places at once. The Sumerian tablets, when read alongside these parallels, no longer feel singular. They feel like one voice in a larger chorus, each singing from a different landscape, all carrying the same undertone. Civilization did not begin where we see it. It reappeared, shaped by memory, necessity, and a shared resilience that left behind patterns too consistent to ignore. The idea of a civilizational reset does not belong solely to myth. It appears quietly in scientific data, embedded in graphs, ice cores, and sediment layers that describe a planet in flux. Long before writing fixed memory into language, Earth itself recorded moments of disruption with indifferent precision. These records reveal that the stability modern societies take for granted is a recent and fragile condition. At the end of the last ice age, the planet experienced rapid climatic oscillations. Temperatures rose, fell, and rose again within spans short enough to affect human lifetimes. Meltwater surged into oceans, raising sea levels and reshaping coastlines. Entire regions that once supported dense human populations disappeared beneath water. These changes were not gradual background noise, they were shocks. One such event, known as the Younger Dryas, marks a sudden return to near-glacial conditions after a period of warming. Evidence for this shift appears across the northern hemisphere. Vegetation patterns change abruptly. Animal populations decline. Human settlements reorganize or vanish from the record. The cause remains debated, with hypotheses ranging from ocean circulation changes to extraterrestrial impacts. What is not debated is the scale of disruption. In a world experiencing such instability, continuity becomes a challenge. Societies adapt by becoming mobile, flexible, and cautious. Large permanent structures become liabilities. Knowledge is carried in people rather than places. Under these conditions, cultural accumulation continues, but it leaves few durable traces. When stability returns, the release can feel sudden. Populations settle. Architecture reappears, systems formalize. To later observers, this looks like abrupt innovation. In reality, it may represent the visible phase of a much longer process compressed by survival. The reset does not erase knowledge entirely, it filters it. Techniques that prove adaptable endure, others fade. What survives is not necessarily what was most advanced, but what was most resilient. Over time, this selection shapes the core of civilization. Natural forces are not the only candidates for such resets. Social dynamics also play a role. As populations grow and resources concentrate, power structures emerge that favor simplification and control. Knowledge becomes stratified. Some information is preserved, some restricted, some forgotten. This is not conspiracy. It is function. Priestly classes, administrative elites, and later imperial systems often act as curators of memory. They decide what is taught, what is recorded, and what is allowed to fade. In periods following disruption, stability is prized. Narratives that emphasize order, divine sanction, and linear progress help maintain cohesion. Stories of collapse do not. Over time, this curatorial process can resemble erasure, not through malice, but through selection. Knowledge that does not serve immediate social needs becomes expendable. Complex histories are flattened. Cycles become origins. Resets become beginnings. The Sumerian record sits at the intersection of natural and social resets. Flood layers suggest environmental shocks. Administrative texts suggest rapid stabilization. Myths suggest memory reshaped into narrative. Together, they imply a society aware, at least intuitively, that it stood on the far side of something lost. This awareness may explain the emphasis on recording. Writing becomes urgent when memory feels fragile. Lists, measurements, and calendars are defenses against forgetting. They do not capture everything. They capture what is deemed essential. The gods enter this context as stabilizers. They provide continuity where human systems feel provisional. By anchoring authority in the divine, societies protect their structures from challenge. Questioning the system becomes sacrilege. This helps prevent fragmentation during recovery. Such mechanisms do not require a centralized conspiracy. They emerge naturally in complex societies responding to stress. Over generations, they shape historical consciousness. What remains feels clean, purposeful, and inevitable. The messiness of survival is buried beneath coherence. Modern archaeology inherits these filtered narratives. It reconstructs history from what survived, not from what existed. Gaps are interpreted as absences rather than losses. Sudden appearances are labelled miracles of progress rather than signs of recovery. The idea of repeated resets challenges this comfort. It suggests that humanity has risen, stabilised, and reconfigured multiple times, each cycle leaving behind fewer clues than the last. Not because earlier societies were less capable, but because time and disruption are efficient editors. Technological resets do not require advanced lost civilizations to be meaningful. Even modest societies, given enough time, can develop deep knowledge of their environments. Losing that knowledge through disruption is enough to create the illusion of sudden rediscovery later. This perspective reframes the role of institutions accused of rewriting history. Rather than active suppression, the process may be one of reinforcement. Once a simplified narrative is in place, it perpetuates itself. Challenging it requires destabilizing the very structures it supports. The Sumerians may not have known the full extent of what preceded them, but their records suggest an awareness of compression. Long reign shortened, vast time collapsed into myth. Practical systems survived while explanation shifted. The reset, then, is not a single event, it is a pattern. Environmental stress, social reorganization, selective memory, narrative stabilization. Over and over, humanity passes through this sequence, each time emerging with a history that feels new, even as it rests on forgotten layers. What remains beneath those layers is not silence, but a muted continuity, hinted at in the efficiency of early systems and the confidence of early records. Civilization, seen this way, is not a straight line. It is a spiral, revisiting familiar ground with less memory each time, carrying forward only what can survive the next disruption. As the Sumerian world stabilized, another layer quietly took shape, not as an invention, but as a consolidation. Temples rose not only as places of worship, but as centers of storage, accounting, and coordination. Their walls enclosed grain, livestock records, labor rosters, and astronomical tables. In this arrangement, the sacred and the administrative were inseparable. What appears later as religious authority begins here as custodianship. The earliest temples did not dominate society through spectacle. They functioned through organization. Priests were not yet intermediaries between humanity and an unknowable divine will. They were managers of continuity. They tracked surplus, regulated distribution, preserved calendars, and maintained rituals that synchronized communities with cycles older than any living memory. Their power grew not from revelation, but from reliability. This role aligns with what the tablets reveal. Many of the earliest written records are temple records. They concern offerings, rations, inventories, and obligations. These are not spiritual confessions. They are logistical tools. Writing emerges not to praise gods, but to stabilize systems. The divine names attached to these systems appear almost incidental at first. Labels are fixed to institutions already operating. In this context, priests function less as creators of knowledge, and more as archivists. They inherit methods whose origins are unclear even to them. Their task is preservation, not explanation. Over time, preservation itself becomes authority. Those who hold the records control the narrative of continuity. As generations pass, this custodial role hardens into doctrine. What was once practical becomes sacred by association. To challenge the system is to challenge the gods whose names are now bound to it. Memory gains protection through sanctification. This process subtly reshapes history. Systems that predate formal religion are retroactively framed as divine gifts. Human labor fades into the background. The gods become authors of order. This does not require deception. It is a natural outcome of distance. When origins are forgotten, explanation fills the void. The temple thus becomes a hinge between the visible present and the invisible past. It houses records that reach backward, but only as far as writing allows. Beyond that boundary lies silence. Ritual steps in where documentation ends. Repetition replaces recollection. Priests maintain continuity through cycles. Daily offerings mirror agricultural rhythms. Festivals align with celestial events. These practices reinforce stability by embedding memory in action rather than narrative. Participants do not need to know why a ritual exists, they only need to perform it correctly. In this way, knowledge survives without explanation. This survival strategy is efficient. It preserves function even as meaning erodes. Over time, rituals accumulate symbolic layers. Gods acquire personalities. Myths elaborate. Yet beneath the elaboration, the original purpose remains intact. Synchronization with cycles that once ensured survival. The rise of kingship intertwines with this structure. Kings derive legitimacy from temples, and temples gain protection through kings. Together they form a feedback loop. Authority stabilizes memory. Memory justifies authority. What lies outside this loop fades. This is how selective history emerges, not through intentional rewriting, but through institutional focus. What supports stability is preserved. What complicates it is neglected. The deep past, with its disruptions and resets, offers little guidance for maintaining order. It becomes irrelevant, then invisible. The Sumerian scribes trained within temple schools copy texts generation after generation. In doing so, they freeze language, myths, and records into canonical forms. Variation diminishes, standardization increases. This creates the impression of timeless tradition, even as time continues to pass. What is lost in this process is not knowledge, but context. The systems continue to function, but their origin blur. Later myths explain them in cosmic terms, replacing human trial with divine intent. The gods become guarantors of order because order no longer remembers how it was built. This transformation has long-term consequences. Once knowledge is framed as divine, it becomes less adaptable. Questioning it threatens social cohesion. Innovation slows, not because creativity disappears, but because deviation becomes dangerous. Stability is protected at the cost of flexibility. The irony is that the earlier Sumerian systems emerged from adaptability. They were responses to instability, not expressions of dogma. Over time, those responses calcified into tradition. The memory of adaptation itself was lost. Temples, then, are not merely religious centers. They are memory machines. They preserve fragments of an older world while reshaping them to fit present needs. In doing so, they act as filters, allowing some aspects of the past to pass through while blocking others. This filtering does not erase the past completely. It compresses it. Long histories become short myths. Complex processes become simple decrees. The gods speak where humans once experimented. The tablets that survive reflect this transition. Early records are practical, restrained. Later texts grow more elaborate, more symbolic. The shift does not mark an increase in knowledge, but a change in how knowledge is framed. By the time Sumerian civilization reaches its mature phase, the temple has become the center of both memory and meaning. What came before is no longer accessible except through ritual and myth. The custodians have become interpreters, yet beneath the layers of theology, the original systems continue to operate. Fields are still measured, canals still maintained, stars still tracked. The world remains ordered, not because the gods command it, but because humans continue to uphold structures inherited from a deeper past. The temple does not create this order. It preserves it, reshapes it, and eventually claims it. In doing so, it ensures continuity, but at the cost of forgetting how fragile that continuity once was, and how much was lost before the records ever began. As divine figures take clearer shape in later Sumerian texts, their behavior reveals something subtle. They do not arrive as architects of a blank world. They intervene, regulate, correct, and judge. Their actions resemble management more than creation. They preside over systems already in motion, stepping in when balance falters or authority needs reinforcement. This pattern hints at a deeper function. The gods may represent narrative compression rather than original agency. In early myths, the gods argue over territory, resources, and hierarchy. They assign labor, distribute roles, and establish boundaries. These are not acts of cosmic invention. They are acts of governance. The myths mirror human political concerns, scaled upward and projected into the divine. What had once been handled through practical systems now receives metaphysical explanation. This shift aligns with a society growing more complex and stratified. As distance increases between those who manage systems and those who live within them, explanation replaces experience. The gods become symbols that justify order without requiring understanding. They offer clarity in the form of story, even as the underlying processes remain opaque. Many Sumerian deities are closely associated with specific domains: water, grain, writing, law, time. These domains correspond precisely to the pillars of civilization. The gods do not introduce these elements, they embody them. Their narratives provide cohesion, binding disparate systems into a shared worldview. This embodiment suggests that divine figures may function as mnemonic devices. They personify abstract processes, making them easier to remember and transmit. In cultures where literacy is limited, such personification is efficient. Stories travel further than instructions. Myths preserve function through metaphor. Over time, however, metaphor hardens into belief. The distinction between symbol and source fades. What was once a way to remember becomes an explanation for existence. The gods move from being representations of order to being its supposed origin. This progression can be traced in the increasing complexity of divine genealogies. Gods beget gods, hierarchies form, conflicts arise. These narratives mirror the social dynamics of expanding cities and competing elites. Theology adapts to political reality, offering a cosmic reflection of earthly arrangements. The flood myth exemplifies this compression. A long era of environmental instability and repeated disruption is condensed into a single divine decision. Complexity collapses into narrative clarity. Cause becomes intention. Nature becomes will. The gods speak where geology once acted. Such compression is not deceitful. It is adaptive. Human memory favors coherence over accuracy. When faced with overwhelming spans of time, narrative becomes a tool for survival. It allows societies to carry forward lessons without carrying full histories. In this light, the gods act as containers for lost time. They hold within them layers of experience that can no longer be articulated directly. Each deity gathers fragments of older knowledge, practices, and fears, reshaping them into a form that can persist. This perspective reframes divine omnipotence. The gods are powerful not because they created the world, but because they absorb its memory. They become focal points for meaning in a landscape where original context has eroded. As myths solidify, questioning them becomes increasingly difficult. To challenge a god is to challenge the system that God represents. Law, agriculture, kingship, and time itself become sanctified. Change threatens not just order, but cosmic harmony. This sanctification stabilizes society, but it also freezes it. Innovation slows as tradition gains authority. The past becomes immutable, not because it is well understood, but because it is revered. What lies beneath reverence is often forgotten. Yet traces of the older, pre-divine world remain embedded in the myths themselves. Moments where gods argue, fail, or depend on human action hint at their constructed nature. These cracks reveal the scaffolding beneath the narrative. Some myths preserve memories of a time when humans acted with greater autonomy. Stories of sages, craftsmen, and lawgivers sometimes place humans alongside gods rather than beneath them. These figures feel like echoes of earlier social roles, before authority fully migrated into the divine realm. The gradual dominance of the gods marks not the birth of civilization, but a shift in how civilization understands itself. Responsibility moves upward, explanation replaces experience, memory becomes story. This shift does not erase the earlier world, it overlays it. Systems continue to function as before, but their origins are reinterpreted. The gods become custodians of a past that no longer remembers its human authors. By the time later cultures inherit these myths, the compression is complete. The gods stand at the beginning of time. What came before is inaccessible, absorbed into divine narrative. History begins where memory becomes manageable. The Sumerian tablets capture this transition in motion. Early records are practical and restrained. Later texts grow mythic and expansive. The change does not reflect increasing imagination, but increasing distance from origins. The gods, then, are not intruders into history. They are its editors. They shape how the past is remembered, not by inventing events, but by reorganizing meaning. In doing so, they allow civilization to move forward without carrying the full weight of what it has lost. What remains beneath their stories is a quieter truth. Before the gods appeared, order already existed, and when the gods arrived, they did not create that order. They explained it, preserved it, and in the process concealed how fragile and human its beginnings truly were. Once narrative replaces memory, simplification becomes inevitable. Complex histories do not travel easily across generations. They are heavy, unstable, and often disruptive. What survives instead is what can be repeated without strain, taught without hesitation, and defended without contradiction. Over time, this quiet selection reshapes not only what is remembered, but what is permitted to be remembered at all. In the Sumerian world, this shift unfolds gradually. The earliest tablets tolerate silence. They document systems without justifying their origins. They function without explanation. Later traditions grow increasingly uncomfortable with that restraint. Gaps begin to close. Where uncertainty once remained open, meaning is supplied. The unknown becomes something to be resolved rather than preserved. This transformation coincides with the strengthening of institutions. As temples, kingship, and scribal schools consolidate authority, they also consolidate narrative. Knowledge becomes something to transmit correctly, not something to question deeply. Accuracy gives way to orthodoxy. Stability outweighs curiosity. In such a structure, simplification is not failure, it is design. Streamlined origin stories stabilize societies. They reduce friction. They align belief with governance. Over time, these stories harden into unquestionable foundations. What once explained becomes what must be believed. The past flattens under this pressure. Long cycles collapse into singular events. Multiple disruptions compress into one flood. Generations of adaptation condense into a divine command. Human trial fades behind cosmic intention. The story becomes easier to carry, even as it becomes less true. This pattern is not unique to Sumer. It appears wherever civilizations endure long enough to fear instability more than ignorance. Cultures tend to celebrate emergence and continuity, while minimizing regression and collapse. Loss is softened. Forgetting is reframed as origin. In Sumerian myth, gods are credited with instituting agriculture, writing, and law, systems that the archaeological record shows emerging through long human effort. This attribution is not deception. It is symbolic transfer. Divine authorship protects what must not be questioned. Once protected, these systems resist change. Innovation must disguise itself as restoration. New ideas must wear ancient clothing. Progress survives only when it appears obedient to tradition. Scribal schools become central to this process. They preserve language and myth through meticulous copying. Variation diminishes, canon solidifies. What is not copied disappears. Over generations, absence begins to resemble insignificance. This selective preservation shapes everything that follows. Archaeology uncovers what was recorded, not what was lived. Texts outlast practices. Myth outlives method. The record tilts toward story rather than system. As later empires inherit Sumerian traditions, compression intensifies. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures absorb Sumerian myths, reframing them for new political realities. Each transmission trims context. Each retelling narrows meaning. What remains grows increasingly abstract. By the time these narratives reach the classical world, they are already distant echoes. Greek thinkers encounter fragments severed from their original frameworks. They reinterpret them philosophically, embedding them in new systems of thought. Another layer settles over the past. At every stage, simplification feels like refinement. It feels like clarity. Yet something essential is lost each time. Awareness of fragility. Memory of disruption. The understanding that civilization is not a permanent state, but a condition repeatedly reconstructed. Modern knowledge systems continue this pattern. Academic disciplines divide the past into manageable segments. Archaeology separates from mythology. Geology detaches from history. Linguistics isolates from cosmology. Each field deepens, but connections thin. The whole becomes harder to see. This fragmentation reinforces simplified narratives. Abrupt beginnings remain unchallenged. Gaps are attributed to coincidence rather than pattern. Deep continuity becomes difficult to articulate without crossing disciplinary boundaries that discourage synthesis. What replaces it is a comforting arc, primitive to advanced, chaos to order, myth to reason. It suggests inevitability. It implies ascent. Yet the Sumerian record resists this shape. It gestures toward recursion rather than progress, recovery rather than invention. The cost of simplification is subtle but profound. It dulls sensitivity to loss. It normalizes forgetting. When civilization is treated as inevitable, its vulnerability disappears from awareness. The lessons encoded in collapse fade quietly. The gods, as simplified symbols, remain powerful precisely because they obscure complexity. They offer answers where questions once lived. They allow societies to move forward without confronting the full weight of what has been lost. Yet traces remain, in reigns that stretch too far back, in systems that appear too refined, in languages that carry structures older than their myths. These traces resist containment. They whisper of a past that was not simple, not linear, and not fully remembered. Simplification does not destroy that past. It buries it beneath meaning. It wraps it in narrative. It renders it safe. The Sumerian tablets press gently against this burial. Their silences feel intentional. Their omissions carry weight. They do not deny what came before. They step carefully around it. In doing so, they reveal something enduring. Civilizations do not only build forward, they compress backward. They trade depth for coherence. They exchange memory for stability. What survives is not the past as it was, but the past as it could be carried. And beneath that narrowed inheritance, something remains unresolved. Quiet, persistent, and just beyond the reach of the stories told to make the world feel whole. Modern archaeology approaches the ancient world with tools of precision, patience, and restraint. It measures, catalogues, and compares. It reconstructs timelines from fragments, drawing cautious lines between what can be proven and what must remain uncertain. Yet within this discipline lies a quiet tension. The very methods designed to protect accuracy can also obscure patterns that refuse to fit established frameworks. Excavation works by layers. What is deeper is older. What is higher is newer. This logic is sound, but it carries an unspoken assumption. Continuity is expected unless clearly broken. When evidence disrupts this expectation, it is often treated as anomaly rather than signal. Gaps become inconveniences. Abrupt appearances become puzzles to be minimized. In the case of Sumer, archaeology confirms the sudden visibility of complex systems. Writing, urbanization, and administration appear together, densely packed in time. The standard explanation invokes preservation bias or incomplete excavation. These explanations are reasonable, yet they are also insulating. They prevent deeper discomfort from surfacing. Institutions, like civilizations, prefer stability. Academic disciplines form consensus models that guide interpretation. These models are not conspiracies. They are frameworks that allow collaboration and cumulative progress. Yet once established, they exert gravity. Evidence is pulled toward them. Interpretations that strain the framework are softened or postponed. This inertia shapes what questions are asked. Research often focuses on refinement rather than revision. How did writing evolve? How did cities expand? Less often does it ask whether the visible beginning is truly the beginning. The question itself feels destabilizing. Funding structures reinforce this pattern. Excavations require resources. Grants favor projects with predictable outcomes. Radical reinterpretations carry risk. Careers are built on incremental contribution, not foundational challenge. Over time, this encourages caution over curiosity. This does not invalidate archaeological knowledge. It contextualizes it. The discipline excels at describing what survived. It is less equipped to describe what did not. Absence becomes silence rather than evidence. Yet absence, when patterned, can speak. In Sumer, the patterned absence of developmental stages remains striking. Early systems are too complete, too integrated. Archaeology notes this, but often brackets it as unresolved. The mystery remains acknowledged but contained. The challenge deepens when interdisciplinary evidence enters the picture. Geology, climatology, and genetics introduce timelines that do not always align neatly with cultural models. Rapid climate shifts, population bottlenecks, and migration patterns suggest instability, where cultural narratives assume continuity. Integrating these perspectives requires crossing disciplinary boundaries that were not designed for synthesis. Each field has its own language, methods, and standards of proof. Collaboration is possible, but difficult. In the gaps between fields, larger patterns can dissolve. Modern narratives of progress further complicate interpretation. The idea that civilization steadily advances from simplicity to complexity is deeply ingrained. It aligns with technological optimism and reinforces modern identity. Evidence of regression or repeated collapse disrupts this story. It suggests vulnerability rather than inevitability. As a result, interpretations that emphasize continuity of advancement feel safer. They preserve the arc. Sumer becomes the cradle of civilization, not a waypoint. The story begins where the record is clearest, not where it may truly start. Untranslated tablets add another layer of uncertainty. Vast numbers of cuneiform texts remain unread, or only partially understood. Administrative documents dominate, while more ambiguous texts receive less attention. What does not fit existing categories waits in archives, silent not because it lacks meaning, but because meaning requires time and focus. Even translation itself shapes interpretation. Language carries assumptions. Choices made by early translators influence generations of readers. Subtle nuances can shift emphasis from process to myth, from continuity to creation. Once established, translations become reference points, difficult to revise. None of this implies deliberate suppression. It reflects how systems of knowledge stabilize themselves. They reward coherence. They discourage ambiguity. Over time, they mirror the very processes that shaped ancient narratives. The result is a modern echo of ancient simplification. Complex, layered pasts are rendered into manageable stories. Abrupt beginnings become accepted. Deep silences are normalized. The discomfort fades into familiarity. Yet anomalies persist. They surface in footnotes, conference discussions, and unresolved debates. They linger without resolution, suggesting that the current models, while useful, are incomplete. The past presses gently against their boundaries. Some researchers push against these limits, exploring deep time perspectives that integrate climate science, archaeology, and mythology. Their work often sits at the margins, not because it lacks rigor, but because it challenges comfort. It asks not how civilization rose, but how often it fell. This shift in focus changes interpretation. Sumer becomes less a starting point and more a reassembly. Writing becomes preservation rather than invention. Myths become compression rather than creation. The record becomes a snapshot taken after recovery. Such perspectives remain controversial. They complicate teaching. They resist simplification. They demand humility in the face of incomplete knowledge. Yet they align closely with the evidence of disruption and recovery embedded in the earth itself. Modern archaeology stands at a threshold similar to that faced by ancient scribes. It must decide what to preserve, what to question, and what to leave open. Its tools are powerful, but its narratives are still human. The silence before Sumer is not empty. It is simply unlit. The absence of clear answers does not imply absence of history. It suggests that history unfolded under conditions that did not favor preservation. What survives are systems that worked, stories that stabilized, and records that endured pressure. What vanished are experiments, failures, and transitions that left no durable mark. To listen to that silence requires accepting uncertainty. It requires seeing gaps as meaningful rather than inconvenient. It requires allowing the possibility that civilization's story is not linear, but cyclical, shaped by forces larger than any single culture. The tablets remain where they have always been, bearing witness without explanation. Modern interpretation circles them carefully, illuminating details while leaving shadows intact. Between what is known and what is assumed lies a space where deeper history may still reside, waiting not for discovery, but for the willingness to acknowledge that the beginning we recognize may not be the beginning at all. Remembering too much carries its own weight. Civilizations that endure learn this slowly, often through loss rather than insight. Memory, when it stretches too far back, destabilizes the present. It reminds societies that what exists now has failed before, that order is not guaranteed, that continuity is provisional. Over time, forgetting becomes a form of self-preservation. The Sumerian record hints at this tension. What survives is not an exhaustive account of the past, but a curated inheritance. Systems remain, numbers persist, calendars endure. But the stories that explain how these things came to be grow simpler, cleaner, more distant from lived experience. The deeper past recedes, not because it lacks importance, but because it carries risk. To remember collapse is to admit vulnerability. To remember repeated collapse is to undermine confidence entirely. Societies that wish to endure cannot dwell indefinitely on fragility. They must believe, at least partially, in permanence. Selective memory enables this belief. The gods serve this function well. They absorb responsibility for origins and endings alike. Creation and destruction become divine acts rather than human experiences. This relocation of agency protects social identity. If disaster comes from the gods, it is not failure. If order comes from the gods, it is not accidental. Meaning stabilizes where memory might otherwise fracture. This mechanism appears repeatedly across cultures. Traumatic histories are mythologized. Catastrophes become singular events rather than extended processes. Survival becomes destiny. What was endured becomes what was meant to be. In this reframing, pain becomes purpose. The cost is subtle. As memory contracts, adaptability weakens. When past failures are forgotten or transformed into legend, their lessons fade. Systems ossify. Innovation becomes risky. Tradition gains authority not because it is proven, but because it is old. In Sumer, the early dynamism that produced writing, administration, and astronomy eventually gives way to repetition. Rituals solidify. Texts become canonical. Language freezes. The civilization persists, but its capacity to respond creatively diminishes. It becomes strong, then brittle. This brittleness is not unique. It marks many long-lived societies. Stability is achieved by narrowing acceptable variation. What falls outside tradition is marginalized. Over time, the range of possible futures shrinks. The deepest memories, the ones that speak of cycles, resets, and recoveries, become dangerous in such a context. They imply that collapse is not anomaly, but pattern. They threaten the illusion of permanence. Better then to let them fade. The Sumerians did not erase these memories entirely. They encoded them indirectly, in reigns that stretch impossibly long, in floods that reset time, in gods who argue, fail, and withdraw. These are safe containers for unsafe truths. Myth allows memory to survive without destabilizing the present. It transforms experience into symbol. The symbol can be honored without being interrogated. In this way, societies remember without remembering. Modern audiences inherit this filtered memory. We encounter ancient civilizations through their myths and monuments, not through their uncertainties. The past appears confident, purposeful, and complete. Its fractures are hidden beneath narrative coherence. Yet the tablets resist full containment. Their administrative dryness, their unexplained assumptions, their sudden sophistication, all suggest a deeper story pressing against the surface. They hint at knowledge carried forward cautiously, trimmed of excess, shaped to endure. To recover that deeper story would require reopening old wounds. It would require accepting that civilization is not a steady ascent, but a fragile equilibrium repeatedly regained. Such acceptance carries emotional cost. It unsettles identity. It complicates progress. This may be why the deepest layers remain unspoken, not only because evidence is scarce, but because the implications are uncomfortable. They suggest that modern society is not unique in their vulnerability. They suggest that what feels permanent may not be. The Sumerians, standing at the edge of their own remembered history, chose continuity over completeness. They preserved what allowed them to function. They let the rest dissolve into story. In doing so, they ensured survival, but at the cost of clarity. Their choice echoes forward. Every civilization inherits not only knowledge, but habits of forgetting. These habits shape what is possible. They determine which questions are allowed to surface and which remain buried. The cost of remembering too much is instability. The cost of remembering too little is repetition. Between these extremes lies a narrow path, one that societies walk unconsciously, guided by instinct rather than intention. The tablets rest at this threshold. They carry enough memory to hint at a deeper past, but not enough to reconstruct it fully. They gesture towards cycles without naming them. They preserve systems without recounting their origins. In this restraint, there is both loss and wisdom. Loss, because so much remains unreachable. Wisdom, because endurance often depends on knowing what not to carry forward. What remains unresolved is not whether something came before the gods. The record quietly affirms that it did. What remains unresolved is whether remembering that fully would strengthen civilization or unravel it. The Sumerians chose to let that knowledge fade into silence, wrapped in myth and ritual. The silence persists, not empty, but heavy, carrying the weight of things once known and deliberately set down, so that the present could continue without being crushed by the past. What survives into history is rarely what mattered most. It is what endured pressure, repetition, and usefulness. Everything else, hesitation, experimentation, failure, transition, falls away first. By the time a civilization appears clearly in the record, it has already learned what to forget. The Sumerian tablets bear this quiet burden. They do not speak of uncertainty. They do not record doubt. They present a world already arranged, already stabilized, already confident enough to count, measure, and assign. Yet this confidence feels guarded, as if built atop an awareness that stability is not guaranteed. The deeper past implied by these texts is not celebrated. It is managed. Long reigns are compressed. Vast spans of time are reduced to lists. Disruptions become singular events. Complexity collapses into structure. What remains is not an honest memory of what happened, but a usable memory of what must continue. Remembering everything would have been dangerous. To remember repeated collapse is to weaken faith in endurance. To remember adaptation is to admit that systems can fail. Societies that survive long enough tend to choose coherence over completeness. The gods play a central role in this choice. They absorb uncertainty and transform it into intention. Floods become decisions, loss becomes judgment, recovery becomes mercy. In this framing, chaos no longer threatens meaning. It is contained. This containment allows civilization to move forward without paralysis. People can plant, build, and govern without constantly confronting the fragility beneath their feet. Myth becomes a stabilizing technology, as essential as irrigation or writing. Yet myth also seals memory. Once events are explained through divine narrative, they become closed. They no longer invite investigation. They become truths rather than experiences. Over time, the space for alternative remembering narrows. The Sumerians did not invent this pattern. They inherited it, refined it, and passed it on. Later civilizations would do the same. Each layer of history simplifies further, carrying forward what supports continuity and shedding what destabilizes it. This shedding is not neutral. It shapes identity. When societies forget that they rebuilt before, they begin to believe they are permanent. Progress feels inevitable. Collapse feels unthinkable. The lessons embedded in deep time fall silent. The tablets resist full erasure. Their structure betrays their restraint. The lack of origin stories. The absence of invention myths for writing, agriculture, or governance. These omissions are telling. They suggest that the authors knew more than they chose to say. What they preserved instead were systems. Systems can survive forgetting. They can function without explanation. A calendar works whether or not one remembers who first aligned it with the sky. A canal carries water regardless of how many times its design was lost and rediscovered. In this sense, Sumer represents not the birth of civilization, but its consolidation after loss. A moment when knowledge hardened into form, trimmed of narrative excess, stripped of dangerous memory, and pressed into clay for safekeeping. This consolidation carries a cost. Once knowledge is frozen, it becomes harder to adapt. When change arrives, as it always does, rigid systems fracture more easily. What was preserved for stability can become a liability. Sumer itself would experience this. City-states rise and fall. Power shifts, languages change, the gods evolve. Yet the foundational systems persist, passed from culture to culture, increasingly detached from their origins. By the time later empires inherit these systems, they feel ancient and unquestionable. Their beginnings are no longer human, they are cosmic. This elevation protects them, but it also ensures that their original context remains unreachable. Modern societies stand at a similar threshold. We inherit systems whose origins we barely understand. We rely on narratives that smooth over disruption. We prefer stories of progress to stories of recovery. The Sumerian record offers a quiet warning, not through prophecy, but through pattern. It shows how easily memory contracts, how readily complexity is traded for coherence, how often civilization survives by forgetting what it once knew. What lies before the gods in these tablets is not a golden age or a lost utopia. It is something more unsettling, a long, uneven process of human organization, adaptation, and loss that does not fit neatly into myth. The gods enter not at the beginning, but at the moment when remembering becomes too heavy. They arrive when explanation is needed to replace memory. They stand where human history grows thin. The silence before them is not emptiness. It is the residue of choice. A decision, made slowly, collectively and unconsciously, to let certain things fade so that others could endure. What remains unresolved is not the existence of that deeper past, but our relationship to it. Whether acknowledging it strengthens resilience or undermines confidence, whether remembering cycles prepares societies for change or weakens their sense of purpose. The Sumerians answered this by leaning toward endurance. They carried forward what worked and allowed the rest to dissolve into story. Their tablets reflect this balance, holding structure without confession. In their restraint, they leave behind something fragile and powerful, a record that does not tell us everything, but tells us enough to sense the weight of what is missing. A reminder that civilization is not only built from knowledge, but from deliberate forgetting, and that what we choose not to remember often shapes the future more than what we preserve. When the tablets finally fall silent, they do not do so with finality. There is no conclusion pressed into clay, no summation of meaning, no declaration that the story is complete. The record simply thins, fragments, and gives way to other voices, other scripts, other gods. What remains behind feels less like an ending, and more like a hand withdrawn slowly from view. By the time later civilizations look back towards Sumer, the gods stand firmly at the beginning of time. Creation stories have settled. Flood myths have hardened. Kings rule by divine sanction. The world feels explained. And yet, beneath this clarity, the older unease remains, barely concealed by narrative polish. The silence before the gods is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of compression. Too much has already been lost for the record to speak plainly. Too many cycles have passed. Too many reconstructions have overwritten their own foundations. What survives is what could endure being carried forward without breaking the present. Civilization, seen through this lens, is not a monument rising steadily upward. It is a shoreline, reshaped again and again by waves that leave behind familiar contours, even as the ground beneath shifts. Each generation builds with confidence, rarely aware of how much has already been washed away. The Sumerians did not stand at the dawn of history. They stood at a clearing. Behind them lay dense growth, memories, practices, adaptations that had become too tangled to preserve intact. Ahead lay the need for order, coherence, and stability. Writing became the tool that allowed one side of that divide to remain visible. What they chose to record reveals their priorities. Not wonder, but function. Not origin, but continuity. Not speculation, but maintenance. These are the choices of a society that understands, perhaps intuitively, that survival depends less on knowing where one came from than on ensuring that what exists continues to work. The gods enter precisely at this juncture. They are not the source of order, but its guardians. They watch over systems that already exist, sanctifying them against erosion. In doing so, they transform history into meaning. The past becomes purposeful. Loss becomes justified. Forgetting becomes sacred. This transformation is gentle. It does not announce itself as revision. It unfolds naturally as distance grows and context fades. Stories step in where memory falters. Symbols replace processes. Names replace experiences. Over time, the distinction becomes impossible to trace. Modern eyes, trained to seek beginnings, often miss this nuance. We look for the first city, the first word, the first law. We want points of origin because they promise clarity. Yet the Sumerian record offers something more unsettling. The suggestion that origins are rarely visible when they matter most. What matters, instead, is what survives disruption. Knowledge that can be rebuilt. Systems that can be reassembled. Patterns that can be remembered even when explanations are gone. Civilization persists not because it is invincible, but because it is adaptable in what it carries forward. The silence before the gods holds this lesson quietly. It speaks of human capability without divine framing, of order achieved through observation, repetition, and shared effort, of societies that learned, lost, and learned again, long before those processes were wrapped in myth. This does not diminish the gods, it reframes them. They become markers of a threshold, standing where memory transitions into story. They signal the point at which the past becomes too deep to hold directly, and must be shaped into something lighter, something that can travel. The tablets, with their careful lists and restrained tone, remain closer to that threshold than anything that follows. They do not dramatize, they do not persuade, they endure. In their endurance, they offer a rare glimpse of civilization between forgetting and belief. What they leave unsaid is as important as what they preserve. The absence of beginnings, the lack of invention myths, the calm assumption of systems already in place. These are not oversights, they are traces of a choice made long ago to let certain knowledge rest so that life could continue. As the last lines of clay fade into dust, what remains is not an answer, but a posture, a way of standing in time that acknowledges depth without demanding access, a recognition that some histories are not lost but set down deliberately. The world before the gods was not empty, chaotic, or primitive. It was structured, practiced, and human. It carried knowledge that did not need divinity to function, only continuity. When divinity arrived, it did so not to create, but to preserve, to stabilize, to make forgetting safe. That pattern has never left us. Each era inherits systems whose origins feel distant. Each era tells stories that simplify what came before. Each era believes quietly that this time is different. The Sumerian tablets do not correct this belief. They do something subtler. They leave space around it. They allow the attentive listener to sense that beneath every beginning lies another recovery, and beneath every explanation lies an older silence. In that silence, civilization breathes slowly, carrying forward just enough of itself to endure, letting the rest dissolve back into time, unspoken, unresolved, and still present, like a shadow that lengthens as the light fades.